Chelsea's love of sport and her interest in organizational change led her on a journey she couldn't have predicted at the time but felt called to explore. Chelsea's bold move proved to be extremely timely. Now, as a professor of sport culture and power and leader at the Players Coalition, she can look back and see just how important it was for her to stay true to herself. Chelsea and I met in our doctorate program, and I loved her from the moment I met her. She is so smart and has so much wisdom. You're going to love this episode of Lead with Dr. Leslie.
Hi, friend. You look so amazing. I love your hair.
Thank you. I know it's so different, isn't it?
I love it.
Thank you.
Wow.
I've been I'm calling this season my sabbatical, which has been kind of awesome. So I'm just reading a lot, writing a lot, doing coaching, and it's awesome.
The question that my friends had asked was, what would you call this chapter of your life? And so I guess yours would be the sabbatical. Mine would be the Renaissance. I feel like there's all of these new, fun, unexplored spaces. I'm just dipping my toes into.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. One of the things I've seen about you is just like, you are just somebody who has a lot of wisdom. And I feel like direction at a young age, which a lot of people don't necessarily relate to that, I think, because it's hard to figure out like, what is your purpose? What is your calling? What does make you feel alive? And I see you as somebody who goes toward that.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I do try to be intentional with doing things that I feel like mean something. So
yeah,
that's encouraging to hear that other people.
Probably why you've gotten to where you're at so far. We met in our doctorate program, I should share. And Chelsea was one of those people who just immediately, I knew I needed to be friends with her because she was cool, but she was also really just wise. And I always try to surround myself with people who I think are smarter than me. Let's get into it. It would be awesome if you could tell the audience a little bit about yourself. What's your journey been? How'd you get here?
Yeah, so my name is Dr. Chelsea Heyward. Doctor sort of recently coined in the same light as you, which is just an honor. Starting sort of way back, did my undergrad at Long Beach State for psychology, the master's program that I went through, graduate program of sport management. So I did that program and had the director of the program on my dissertation committee, who upon my final defense told me that they had a class they wanted me to teach. And long story short, ended up teaching that class because I taught that class, got connected to a similar class at Morehouse. And then all of that surmised into what my dissertation was about, which was improving the effectiveness of athlete activism, a topic that was really, all of my paper talked about how this was a non-normative behavior. And then 2020 happens and all of the athletes are activists. So in that sort of weird cyclical way, I've been very cart before the horse without realizing it, just following my passion. In continuing my education through USC, the weekend we had to choose our dissertation topics was the weekend Trump called the NFL players SOBs. And so they had kept telling us, choose a space that you have influence in and access to. And I was like, I don't know how much influence I have here, but I have a ton of access because group chats were going off and all these messages were coming in as I'm thinking like, what should my topic be? And then it's like pinging me like, it should be about this, it should be about this. And then finally it clicked. And I was like, oh, I could do athlete activism. Like that's a thing. And a lot of the professors actually tried to dissuade me from doing my dissertation about that because there wasn't enough academic research. It wasn't a prominent enough thing. And I was like, no, I care about this and I don't want to spend time on something I don't care about. So we figured out how to make it work. The final sort of delivery point was a one-pager on sort of a path forward for professional athletes. If you want to maximize your impact, it's about policy reform. So changing systems, and the way we change systems in the United States is changing laws for the most part. And so that whole thing was something I interviewed athletes of the coalition for, and then just sort of continued doing the work I was doing already with the coalition. And then come George Floyd, all of this is coming up and I'm now in a leadership position to be able to speak about this stuff, both having the experience on the work side and then the academic expertise in having done the research. So it was a weird right place, right time, right tools kind of moment.
That's amazing. And I want to get back to that because before we got started, you and I had a really great conversation about kind of following your purpose and your passion. And it sounds like that's what you were doing there. So I want to ask a little bit more about that. But Before I do that, I want to bring back the point you said about kind of the timing of your research. So when you were doing your research, your findings were such that you were able to conclude that it was probably more unlikely than likely for athletes to step into the activist role, is what I'm hearing you're saying. So can you just give us a few observations of how you think that's really in the last maybe year and a half, 2 years, like how has that landscape really changed and what does that look like?
Yeah, I think first the space has grown. So like I said, the majority of my dissertation was saying like, this isn't really a thing, but if it were a thing, this is how it should be done. And then all of a sudden it was being done. And so what happened was following the murder of George Floyd, athletes were, the nation really was fed up with injustice and racial inequality. And so everyone was trying to figure out what they could do. Athletes wisely recognized the power of their platforms and were trying to figure out how to use that as a weapon for change. So we talk about what that space looks like now. It really went from the 5 guys that went on that first meeting to Capitol Hill to meet with legislators to now the 1,400 athletes that we've come into contact with and worked with on pushing, I believe, 25 pieces of legislation through to passage now.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think what I'm also kind of left in awe about here is sort of, you already alluded to this. This has been a really great model to observe how activism can change systems from within. And you gave some really tangible examples about what that looked like. What it, I think often when sometimes we hear activism, and when we think about that related to race relations in our nation, we think a lot about people hitting the streets. We think about, protesters with signs. We think a lot about the visible community activism, but we don't always learn about what it's like to change structures and systems from within. And I'm wondering, what your this is a big question, but what your observations about how the system has been changed from within, from the athletes, from the activists, from these meetings, from these efforts, what does that look like for individuals working in environments in which systems need to change? The systems themselves are they're the barriers. They are the problem. And often I think folks who are in leadership roles or maybe are ascending the ladder in leadership roles feel maybe helpless about what can I do to move my organization forward? Are there lessons you've learned from these observations that you might impart on other leaders who are trying to make a difference within systemic organizations that really need to change?
Yeah, I think I could sum it up with sort of a theory that I've been threading through all of these spaces called opinion versus decibels. And so in seeing all of everything that we've seen, I guess the last 4 or 5 years with our leadership in this country, it kind of came down to this idea where you can be right, but if you aren't loud, it won't matter. And so if you're wrong and loud, your message will still get through, unfortunately. And so what that thought is that decibels will forever outweigh opinions. And so the way that you gain more decibels is either by being loud yourself. So being a person with a large following, a large platform, whether that's an entertainer or an athlete or a politician or somebody who society for whatever reason has placed this important title on. And then if that's not the case, then having a lot of people advocate on your behalf becomes important. So anytime where you can get a collective groundswell of people to move with you, that can't be ignored. So when you're in an office environment and you're not being heard, find out who else is not being heard and rally together, even if you guys have opposing issues or issues that don't relate to each other, because you still have a shared identity in not being heard. And so pushing for that ear of whoever's in charge at that moment. Another way to gain more decibels is so outside of having loud people advocate on your behalf or having a lot of people advocate with you, is having something so contrary to what the system is used to happen. And I think the example we see there is with Colin Kaepernick. It wasn't a big deal until loud people started talking about it and until a lot of people started talking about it. And so in that space, because he hadn't said much himself up until the point, in that space, there was a groundswell of support for what he was doing. And I think it's also important just on that point to acknowledge all of the athletes and researchers that came before me. And so by no means am I saying that myself or the athletes that we work with were the first to do it. This is just one of the more recent times we've seen it done at mass. And there are a ton of great researchers still doing this work who've been doing it even longer than I have. And I'd be just remiss if I didn't acknowledge all of their work. But back to that, opinions versus decibels. And so beyond there, once you're able to make those shifts, again, either from someone loud, having a lot of people advocate on your behalf, or doing something so contrary to popular belief that people have to talk about it, would be how I would push forward. And I think that can be kind of vague for like, well, what does that mean for me in my moment? But that's where we have to start then thinking critically.
I love that. Y'all see what I'm saying? Wisdom. I really appreciate how you were able to take lessons from your observations and apply that in a general framework. I think that makes perfect sense. And I think that it really is good food for thought as a beginning of, as you said, the challenge now. Now maybe you understand the framework, and now there needs some critical thought around that framework to apply in your context.
For sure. I think the interesting thing too is that one of the cool things we've seen in this space, which may apply to other people pushing for reform in whatever capacity, whether that's a pay raise or an organization change, I guess a note there is that I often refer back to the model that they made us use.
KMO.
The KMO, the Knowledge Motivation Organization. I hated that when they're making us do it.
KMO.
Like, well, it's clear they don't have the knowledge, or they don't want to do it, or the organization's not set up for them to do it. And I'm like, every time.
Oh my God, same Z's. I'm always like, oh, I hated KMO so much, but it's applicable to everything always.
It really is.
It's a solid framework.
But along that note, I think for what we've also seen is the intersection of differing ideas, or ideas that didn't feel like they should be together. So of course, there's the general narrative of sport and politics remaining separate that a lot of people were trying to employ several years ago. But when you think about how so many of these advances in society are born, it happens through the merger of seemingly incohesive ideas. So when you talk about architecture, they lean a lot into nature and how that works. When you talk about advancements in technology, sometimes they're looking at how things are working in healthcare to advance microchips. And then we figure out, okay, if we bring these two different industries together, it can bring us both forward. And I think that's metaphorical for working together and collaborating, where we build bridges over borders and have people who maybe don't agree on an issue find a common ground, so we can, as a society, advance forward as a whole.
Yeah, I think creativity is one of the most beautiful foundational aspects of being a human. And our ability to do what you just said, like take two different ideas and merge them into something new, I think that can be also purpose for us. I think each and every human being, we have a desire to create, and actually our brains are wired that way when you look at the way that our brains have evolved. And other animals, other creatures on this planet don't create like we do. And so it's a beautiful thing. I love that you're talking about merging ideas and creation as a way to move our society forward. I want to talk a little bit about finding your zone of genius. It sounds like you have. When it comes to, we were talking earlier about how it feels really good to you to work, that it's fulfilling, that you have found something that you are excited to do every single day. So I want to know a little bit more about that. What's that like to discover that for yourself? And why is it that you think you found something that you're so excited about? Why does it work for you?
I think first, I have to acknowledge that that's a privileged place to sit in, to be able to be fulfilled in my work, because that means that I have choice. And I think a lot of my motivation comes from having the choice to do what I want. And so I'm doing what I want because I made choices. And because of my environment, because of my upbringing, because of my education, because of things that were out of my control that ended up working out for me, I'm able to do all of these things. And so I think that's first important to acknowledge. And that's not to say that someone who doesn't have choice can't get there. It just may take a few more choices to be able to end up there. But I feel like I just follow a vibe. Like if I'm not feeling something, I don't want to do it anymore. And it may take me longer, especially I'm very people driven. So if I'm attached to the people in that space, it may take longer to separate myself from that and follow what it is that I want. But between following my heart and then doing all of the things that make me happy, I try to always figure out, again, that merging ideas, I guess, is a theme just for my life. When I was little, I couldn't decide if I wanted to be a vet or a dentist. So I was like, I'll just be a veterinary dentist. Like, just do
Obviously.
And I think that same train of thought has been how I figure things out. I worked multiple jobs. I still work multiple jobs. And within that, I'm able to be in the weeds enough to be able to pull things out and share in other spaces, but also there's a certain level of detachment there so that I'm not only focused on one thing, and I have other spaces that I can lean into for motivation if something else is drawing me down. And so I guess if I were to give other people recommendations of what that looks like, it takes a lot of intentional, intuitive work. So I know myself very well to start. So I know what it is that I like and I don't like. And I would recommend like meditation, yoga, reading, all the things that help you figure that out before just going down a path, or just go down the path and figure out, yeah, I don't like this. And then you can add that to your repertoire.
Yeah, but also what I'm hearing you say, so either start with the self-reflection or not, but be engaged along the way in the self-reflection, right?
Yeah.
Like make sure you're listening to yourself first and foremost. And I think that is really sage advice. And we do hear it a lot, but I think that's because people struggle so much. We struggle with the noise. We struggle with the people pleasing. We struggle with the traumas inside of us that lead us down paths that maybe we know aren't right for us, but we go down anyway for whatever reason. A lot of people struggle doing what you've just described you've been successful doing. So I think that was some wisdom as well.
And I have figured things out through that, through pain, through trauma, through wrong choices. I'm probably one of the more stubborn people that I'm going to keep doing something wrong until I realize that it is wrong. But that engagement, I think that personal engagement and attention to what you're doing is how you can pay enough attention to be able to finally hear yourself be like, oh, I don't like this thing. I'm complaining about it all the time. And then, of course, having a good group of people around you to point things out for you when you're doing something that you look like you're passionate about, or doing something that maybe makes you unhappy, and pour into you.
I love that. You're working multiple jobs and having different experiences. You're sort of plucking pieces and bits from that learning and merging together and making new connections you might not otherwise make. That's happening a lot for me right now.
Yeah.
And as I'm really just focused on what are my core beliefs about leadership, I think I'd boil it down into three things that really good leaders need to focus on. And that would be your beliefs, your behavior, and your impact. Our beliefs are informed by our experiences, our lived experiences, and the beliefs that we hold inform our behavior, and our behavior informs our impact. So it's sort of cyclical if you think about it. And maybe it's oversimplified, but for me, it's a really good framework to think about. Good leaders need to turn inward first in order to have the impact they're hoping for as leaders. What do you think about that?
I think that's the fantastic framework. I think I made one similar actually, but I think I like yours better because it's simpler and easier to speak about. Last year, we saw, like I said, unprecedented amount of athlete involvement, but I think just because I'm so deep into sports, everything that I do, I like hold sport on this pedestal, maybe wrongfully so, but I felt like sport impacted American culture in ways like it hasn't before. And just being a professor of sport culture and power, those are things I'm looking at. And so I wrote a paper last year on sort of the cultural culmination of America and how that was anchored in sport. And so it started with, it boils down to this idea of people's legacies are shaped first in this sort of pyramid structure, starting with words, because words shape belief systems then influence action. Action and emotions are what drive people to either act out individually or associate with different collective identities. And then from there, based off whatever emotions and actions are continued to be fed off of, cement a person's legacy. So because I said these words, I believe this thing, so I align with these people, so now I am seen as this person. And so it sort of works that. And I tied that all into sport just because I think in an unprecedented way, sport shaped how we saw last year. So it started off being grief-stricken with the death of Kobe Bryant, and put the world on, put the world in a place of pause. And I think before that, Kobe was seen as this person that couldn't be touched. Like, he was such a deity in so many spaces. And the fact that something like that could happen to someone like him made us all look at our life and start thinking about what made us happy, what mattered. Should we send this text to this person about how much we care with them, and so on and so forth. From there, obviously COVID, which America didn't take seriously until Rudy Gobert's diagnosis through the NBA. So that was another sport anchored moment. From there, we had the Michael Jordan documentary was the first instance of people coming back together, even if virtually. It was the first event that people gathered around post-COVID. So while we didn't have anything in person, everyone flooded to Twitter to talk about this documentary and the memories they had from the 90s and how they were feeling about it. And we hadn't had any public events since that second week of March. And from there, following the murder of George Floyd, athletes getting involved in the social justice space. Following that, the shooting of Jacob Blake was the second time that sport would be canceled in the history. The second time that all sports across all leagues would be canceled in the history of sports, outside of when they were just canceled for COVID. And so all of these spaces shape our identity. And so it started first with words being shared, of course, on social media, which formed belief systems, which we saw either united or divided people, depending on what words and what belief systems were shared. And from there, people were then fast forward to the January 6th Capitol riots, and you have very specific vernacular that was used from interventions or ways that it was seeded throughout the year. And so you can't deny the common thread between that. And I just felt like sport was such an anchor through that. And so for that whole 3-minute monologue, your model really embodies that we are all individual leaders, and we have to look at our beliefs, our behaviors to determine the impact that we'll have on the world. Yeah. So I love the sort of marriage between those two.
I do too. What I really love about your framework is just this idea of how impressionable we can be when shaping our identities and our beliefs, yep. How fragile we really are,
yeah.
And how susceptible we are to ideas and right. Beliefs based on what we're hearing, what we're surrounding ourselves with, and really, I guess, the culture we're in, if you will, yeah. Like our family system cultures, our social cultures, all of those things. I mean, it's, yeah. I believe that to be true. I really, as I learn more about how the human brain works, mm-hmm. Just understanding the ways that we form pathways and the ways that our brains are wired toward fear and toward bias. They just are. We're biased toward ourselves and others.
Yeah.
And so, just how quick our identities, our opinions, our beliefs can be formed, maybe without intention. And that's where the danger could come in.
And unfortunately, from that, fear is what makes action happen the fastest. And corporations have capitalized on that from a media perspective, because just from, I guess, evolutionary survival of the fittest. So if something is a danger, I need to pay very close attention so that I can make it out of this moment. And unfortunately, the way that even through clickbait and headlines and all of the short blurbs or videos that you'll see on social media, those things are playing off of that biology and making us more agitated, making us less attentive, making us all the things that separate us from realizing how fragile we are. We're so fragile, yeah. On top of having to hear and see all of the worst things blasted about people, all of the best things posted about people that seem only aspirational, versus having this level playing field of having the time to process a moment versus when it actually happens. We're just totally inundated. And B, having the capacity to respond and move and react without having this thought of this esoteric world that we live in as the best version of ourselves. Yeah. If that is not too out there.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. immediately my brain goes towards, man, I'm so much happier when I turn my phone off, when I'm off social media for the day, when I don't have the news on all the time.
Yeah.
And there's a part of me that also feels uninformed when I do that. I don't always know what's happening in the world. What's your balance there? How do you tend to balance the consuming of our day-to-day struggle with also your personal wellness?
Yeah. So I have these like clear Post-its all over my place. I don't know if you can see like that little one up there.
Yeah.
But they say little things. The one right above my computer, it says, be conscious of your information diet. So something I'm always trying to remember, like, is this going to help me, or is this going to make me feel a particular way? Like, should I be looking at it, so on and so forth. But the way that I try, and I say all that to say it's not a balance. Like, I'm hit or miss. Like, there's been times where I've sent our athletes things and not known that their entire league was going through this whole issue. And I'm like, okay, great. I missed that one. And that was my fault. But there have also been times where as a person, I can feel safe and grounded and connected to those around me. And those make it worth it to me. And so I guess there's a bunch of little things that I do, recognizing that I'm never going to be perfect. But if I try for 10 things and I hit 7, then I'm better off than if I didn't try for any. And so one of the things, I'm very intentional about drinking enough water, getting enough sleep, trying to eat healthy, but I have a big sweet tooth, so that one's not always as feasible. And then even like meditation in the morning, meditation and prayer in the morning, yoga in the morning. I keep my phone away from my bed so that when I have to wake up, I have to either tell Siri to turn off my alarm or get off and go do it, like something that is a more active action than just rolling over and pushing snooze. But I would say that very intentional attention to my physical health is what helps me balance my mental health.
Great tips. Well, thanks so much, Chelsea. This has been, I know, very fulfilling for me. I'm sure as others are listening to your story, your advice, your wisdom, I'm sure you have offered some really great nuggets for our folks to take away. So thank you so much for your time today.
Of course, no problem.